And he sat there lying there on his back, looking up at me. The whole team standing around wondering what's going to happen. Where's this going to end? And he gives me a one finger wave, looks up at me, and he says, F you. I guess there probably is an innate fear of losing, but that can't be the primary motivator for long-term success. My mom got this idea I was going to play tennis or take tennis lessons, and I never even heard of tennis.
Hi, this is Sifu Slim, author of The Aging Athlete. In this book, you're going to get to hear about two different groups of former high-performance athletes. One group, which is made up of 90% of the former athletes, does not do physical activity on a regular basis and tends to suffer the consequences of a sedentary lifestyle. The other group, which is made up of 10% of the former athletes, is doing physical activity on a regular basis and tends to thrive through the aging process, or at least has a better chance at coping with the aging process. We could have taken these folks to a lab and done all kinds of tests on them. Instead, we slowed them down and sat them down and asked them, in their own words, to describe why they're wired the way they are, so that we all, former athletes and non-athletes, can use some of their inspirational and motivational and mindset lessons in our own lives. I hope you pick up a copy today. You can go to theagingathlete.com. And when you have a chance to read it, I'd love to hear back from you to find out what your thoughts are on the stories of these aging athletes. I'm Sifu Slim, and I'm coming to you live from Mexico, where I brought my tennis balls along with me, but it's not for what you think it is. I have no racket, I have no shoes, I have flip-flops, but these are part of the routine that I do for back health and foam rolling. I call it tennis ball rolling. And I usually take about 12 of these with me, and I do my glutes, my back, my neck. So if I take 2 of these, I can make a post, so 2 on each side, and on the ground, and I can do a post and get into here, get my jaw, get my ocular area, get my head, which is good for circulation. As we people without a lot of feathers on our head can tell you, it's good to have circulation up top. And today I'm very pleased to be joined by a person who is known as an emeritus, which means they've paid their dues for decades and half a century in this case. And they have they've paid their dues so much that we call them emeritus, which is a great Latin word for saying that you have merit inside you. While I clear my throat, Dick, please introduce yourself.
Of course, Sifu. My name is Dick Gould. I was a tennis coach at Stanford University for men's tennis, and then retired after 38 years to become the director of tennis for another 14, which allowed me to do some things off the court to promote the program and the facility development and so on. So it was a wonderful 52 years at Stanford. As actually, it is the longest serving employee in the athletic department. And I loved it, and it was a great experience.
There's no one in food services who went from 20 to 80 that beat you out.
You're being kind when you say 80.
So first thing I'm going to ask you, Dick, is I'm a health person. I would call myself Jack LaLanne mixed with a naturopath, mixed with an intellectual. So Robert Sapolsky at Stanford, I'm a big fan of his. Also, I'm a big fan of Christopher Hitchens. Those are in the Anglophile background, English-speaking people, those are my 2 picks as top intellectuals. One scientific and one everything else that's non-scientific would be Christopher Hitchens. Have you met Sapolsky at all?
I have not, actually, and don't confuse me with high-level intellectuals, please.
Have you heard of Dr. Sapolsky at Stanford?
Yes, the name's familiar. I have never met him. And what field is he in?
He has the ability to be in neurosurgery. He knows the brain very well. He knows zoology. He knows psychology. He knows so many things. He would be my pick as the top scientific guy and a specialist in animal behavior. He lived with the baboons in a troop of baboons in Africa each summer of his life for over 30 years. So he's a fun guy to look up on YouTube. You can watch his lectures at Stanford, on some of them on YouTube. He's a brilliant guy.
That's interesting. I'm doing a lot of work with concussion education in the last 5 years, and we're working with a lot of neurosurgeons, including several at Stanford, but our paths have not crossed. But maybe it was with the baboons at the time.
He's one of the, I would call, the most desired people to get an email response from. And I was blessed that about 8 years ago, he responded to one of mine. Now he has an auto email set up that talks about how busy his schedule is and how crazy the world is. So he can't respond right now. So Ventura, California. So I wrote this down right here, Dick from Ventura. So yes, you've written books. Yes, you've done great things at Stanford and with young men, and probably because of your wife, you had some interactions with a female tennis team over the years. But if you could take us back to when you were 6, 8, 10, 12, and let us know if you had a mentor or how someone might have made a difference in your life really early on that set the stage for the man and the young man you were to become.
Well, it was an interesting time to grow up. It was after the Depression. I was born in 1937, and barely after the Depression. My folks were still feeling that. The effects of that was in World War II was about ready to get going, and that was an interesting time to live through as a young child. But Ventura is a coastal town in Southern California, primarily at the time oil and farming. And my dad is a farmer, farmed 13 acres of mostly lemons, citrus, and had been at Stanford and was admitted to biz school and law school, but did not go because of the Depression. He had to go to work and get some pennies in the kitty. And it was a very innocent time to grow up. I love sport. My dad played a little football at Stanford. My mom was active at Stanford in many of the women's sports as such in those days. My dad wrestled at Stanford a little bit. And so it was, I had athletics always in my background. And I played a lot of sports growing up, a little bit of football in junior high school, which I ended up coaching actually at that level when I first started teaching after getting out of Stanford. And then basketball all the way through high school. I was the guy sitting on the end of the pine, yelling like crazy for my teammates, and tennis. And tennis was something I didn't really see if we had any desire to get into. It was a farming town. I'm wearing my boots, my Levi's, and running around shooting squirrels and rabbits with my .22 and rifle, and riding my horse every day. And my mom got this idea that I was going to play tennis or take tennis lessons, and I never even heard of tennis. I was about 11 years old at the time, getting ready to go into junior high school. And I said, no, I'm not going to wear these little white shorts around town and junk my Levi's and boots. And what are my buddies going to think? And she said, well, do you want to ride your horse this summer? And I said, pardon me? And so between my horse and tennis, the tennis won out, and I was able to ride my horse. But I also, when you speak of mentors, I had my first lesson with a guy who really influenced what I did later on and throughout my life. His name was Harold Chafee. His daughter was Nancy Chafee, one of the world's top players at the time, although she didn't win a Grand Slam. She later married Ralph Kiner. And Chafe could sense that I didn't want to be at this lesson. It was interesting because the lesson before his, of course, my parents got me there early and dropped me off. The lesson before mine was little 13-year-old twin girls, 14-year-old twin girls. My hormones at 11 are just starting out. And these little gals with halter tops and hot pants in those days, we called them. I saw them hitting these balls and picking them up, and I thought, this sport has something. And then Chafe gets me on the court. He knew I didn't want to be there, and I was interested in other sports. But he made everything I did exciting. It was exciting to hit the ball on the strings. Everything was equated to the sport. You watch the ball coming off the racket like Ralph Kiner watched it coming out of the pitcher's hand. You step into the ball like Rocky Marciano, the heavyweight champ at the time, steps into his punch. And everything was thrilling as it equated to another sport. And I couldn't wait to get home and try hitting the ball against the garage, which we didn't have a cement driveway or asphalt driveway. The ball landed on the gravel and bounced right and left and didn't bounce at all. But it was fun to try, and I never put my racket down again. So he really influenced me. And I think the big thing I learned from Chafe that influenced my teaching in all phases of my life was to make what I'm doing exciting for my pupil. And you do that by projecting that excitement in your subject matter yourself. And if you think back, Sifu, to the teachers you had, the people that influenced you at a younger age, you might have a course you didn't really care to take, but they were some way able to bring that course alive to you by virtue of their personality and their excitement and devotion to their subject matter. And that was something that was a big, big lesson for me to learn.
Yeah, Dick, I fortunately was introduced to martial arts at a very young age, and wanted to ask you about this ethic. The military uses it, martial arts use it, a very strict school might use it, a yoga center with a guru or a shaman type person might use this. And it's the idea that the headmaster, the person in charge, they may be an owner, they just may be in charge of that space. They're the ones who set the rules. And they didn't just come up with a lot of those rules. That comes from antiquity, and it comes from how people were able to pass on wisdom. And it's different than just knowledge, but you've got knowledge, wisdom, practical skills, life skills, all these types of things. And that's part of the ethic. And in the military, you spoke of World War II. I would call myself a pretty decent World War II historian. I had a life-changing moment in 1985 in Paris, and I was speaking French to a friend who was with me, and I just gotten out of surgery at a hospital in Paris, and an old French woman heard us speak, and she said, "Excusez-moi, est-ce que vous êtes américain?" And she was in her late 70s at the time, so she would have been in her 30s during World War II. And we told her, yes, we spoke English, we were American. And she started crying. And this is 1985. Can you imagine somebody crying about things that happened in the 1940s? Like people like my uncle's generation showing up in Paris to liberate her family and her neighbors and her friends from the Nazi occupation. So she decided, after telling us some stories, to give us a tour of the area and showed us bullet holes in the wall that were places where people she knew, and sometimes friends of hers, were shot by the SS, the Gestapo, these types of things, and places where people were tortured for information, so that they tried to get these people to denounce the resistance and their friends. So she shared that story, and I was already a history major and a French major in college. We talked about Rob Mazzucchelli in an email. He and I graduated in '85 from the University of Richmond. Hello, Rob, if you're checking this out. And so that set the motion that I was going to get into this World War II, because on the emotional level, it was the thing that shook me the most. It still is to this day. If anything anybody ever said, she was kind of like passing on, like Yoda to Luke Skywalker, some very important emotional content. And it set the course of my life to be a person who digs into things, who really examine those mind, body, and spirit, social history, which is how people lived, how they were affected by war, by politics, by decisions, by environmental changes, these types of things. How were people affected? So that's a little bit about social history, and that set the course of my life. And so I forget where I was going with that, but if you remember, tap into it, because I've been going for a little while.
No, that's fascinating. I think because we don't know where these moments are going to happen, when they're going to happen, and what influence they're going to have on us in the future as they're happening. But I know certainly World War II is a great example. And I think that what I have heard about that time, my dad missed that a little bit ahead of that. But the people in the resistance or in the countries like France and so on, to this day, as you say, are so thankful for the memories are not short. And they remember what an effect it had on them, and actually almost going through the same thing today. Ironically, I don't know. Sometimes you wonder how much we learn through history.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah, that I remember reading some things about some of your publications, and I think you mentioned the word ego in there. And I think there are two things that reign over us as the impoverished Homo sapien or three things I'll mention. One thing I learned from people like Robert Sapolsky and other people who study evolutionary biology is that the Homo sapiens are very short term in terms of their thinking. So we're the immediate needs. How are we going to get food, water, shelter? Oh, there's woman, or there's man, or there's food. They're very short term in that consciousness. And then a couple more things about Homo sapien is we're fear-based. So many of us who aren't on the path of self-improvement, self-mastery, some people call it awakening or enlightenment. So if you're not on that path, then you can live in that fear, and you're constantly reacting in a fear-based mentality, which often lends itself to dominance, like Donald Trump, you could say, a dominant personality who lives in fear, can't accept other people for who they are, those types of things. And besides that, you develop anger. So fear is over here, but it's the root of it. Anger is over here, but the root of it tends to be fear. And I don't know if you've seen this and you've coached people on this. Maybe you can share if you have.
Well, I think you said it's an interesting point you made, and I think that to be a great competitor, and you try to define that word, is not necessarily easy, but it's pretty complex. But you can't. I guess there probably is an innate fear of losing, but that can't be the primary motivator for long-term success. And I think that's one of the reasons you see so many of these young people in tennis today who are struggling. They win a tournament and then they feel that they've made a big step in their game. They're in the top 5 in the world, or maybe even number 1. They're 18 years old, 19 years old, 20 years old. And now they have to keep up with that. And then comes a big fear of not measuring up. And so they get in a situation where fight or flight, where they have to stand up and stick their ground, and they're not as effective as they might have been. So I think it's really important. You mentioned ego, Sifu, and that's a big thing, because in whatever you do, in whatever organization you're in, whether it be a nonprofit or whether it be a team setting of some kind, which could be a nonprofit actually, with peers or with people you're working for or with or managing, you have to have the most effective team. You have to have people who believe in themselves. And in hiring, it's a big thing. You want people who have a really big belief in themselves, but that can destroy a team also. Yeah. So trying to manage that and keep it in line where it is a plus for the team and they're still supporting each other and have each other's backs is, I think, really important when you're talking about sport as an example, as a microcosm of life, if you wish. It's a gigantic factor.
So in relationship to fear, so if fear is over here, and then you have performance anxiety right here, and then anger as another step, is there a progression you've seen with people? I listened to an interview with Yannick Noah, whom I met in 79 and 81 at Roland Garros. He's about 2 years older than I am. And I saw an interview with him shot about 6 years ago. And in it, he talked about how sensitive he is as a person. And maybe that's why he's so creative in many music and the industries that he's been involved in, and his coaching as well. But he's a very creative, very sensitive person, he said. And he said one thing that he had a problem with is when someone like McEnroe would have the outburst and then cause like a 2-minute or 5-minute delay, it would profoundly affect Yannick, and he couldn't find his groove after that. He was still in that psychological disruption of the biochemistry and the electric wiring of his brain. Whereas he said McEnroe's gift, and it's kind of a curse to other players and a gift to McEnroe as well, is that he could have that outburst and then go right back and serve an ace or come to the net, put away a winner, almost like nothing had happened. Maybe you could comment on that.
There's a lot of truth to that. And I think that the very best competitors have gone a step further than that. and realize, in essence, unfortunately, that oftentimes it's a part of the game, something that is probably going to happen at some point along the way, maybe in a big match, certainly more often with certain opponents than others. But I think that the Noah was a great player, but maybe this is one of the reasons that he never quite reached the greatness that he had a chance to reach. And I know Mac, he didn't try to do this. He didn't do it on purpose. His parents were not tennis parents. He didn't grow up with the pressure of having someone say, you got to do this, you got to be this, you must do this, you have to be perfect. They just gave him tennis lessons at a local club, a tennis academy, because it was right next door. And then he was pretty much on his own, although they supported him throughout. And I just would see them cringe in the players' box at the Grand Slam tournaments and thinking, oh my gosh, when's he going to erupt? I couldn't watch him play because I didn't know either. And you hate to see someone that you see so many good traits about. In essence, John was a phenomenal team player. He really cared about the team. He never turned down Davis Cup, as an example, no matter how tired he was, or even if he was a little injured, a chance to represent his country. He a very loyal player, a very loyal person. And you hate to see this other side of him come out and people draw conclusions and say, based on this, he's a total jerk, because he was not a total jerk. And yes, on the court at times he was, but people draw conclusions from that. And I think it's interesting to watch John. We're talking about John now, but I think his documentary, which just came out, I think on the 2nd, I haven't seen it yet, but it's supposed to be really, really, really a good documentary and a lot of insight of his own into his behavior and how he developed. And you watch what he's doing now in the world and how much he's giving back to all kinds of causes, which he always has done actually very, very well. But you see a different side of him, what you saw in the tennis sport.
Yeah, speaking of McEnroe, there are probably 20 people in my life I followed quite a bit. Muhammad Ali would be one of them. Michael Jackson I followed quite a bit, and McEnroe I've probably followed more in the last 15 years than anyone. So I've probably watched more old McEnroe matches than McEnroe has. I'm sure he doesn't watch his old matches on YouTube. And I've read his book, and I met him in '81 in Paris as well. And I was captivated by him. I stood in the back at Roland Garros, and I'm the same size now as I was then, 6'2.5". And I'm watching this person, and it seemed to me that he was the best at Roland Garros in '81 at knowing where the other person was going to hit it. So it looked, people could think that he didn't move a lot, but he seemed to have a second sense of where, when he hit those puff backhands that landed in the corners, he almost invariably seemed to know, maybe 70% of the time correct, where the other person was going to come back with their return. And he would kind of shade towards that area, not always shade to the middle, but shade towards that side. So that's one thing I noticed. Another thing I noticed about him is his calls for the lines, his ability to see. And I understand that Jimmy Connors has 20/10 vision. I don't know what McEnroe's is, but it's some great ability to see a ball if it's in or out. Now, I'm sure he's made a few mistakes, but when I watch the old matches of his era, the late 70s through the 90s, and they show the close-ups, it looks to me like out of all the matches I've seen that he was wrong maybe 5 times, and I've probably watched 80 matches of that era. So I think he really had something special about sense of where the ball was going to land, and then the actual vision to see if it was in or out. Maybe you can contact if you know anything about his sensibility, his premonition, and his vision.
Yeah, first of all, I never saw him in the years at Stanford. I never saw him make a bad call. You see that intentionally, oftentimes in college tennis and in junior tennis.
Called hooking.
And yes, absolutely. And it's unfortunately all too commonplace, taking the shortcut. But I never saw Mac make a bad call. That doesn't mean he was always right. I wonder what it'd be like today with the no linesman on the court. His reputation might be very different because of Hawkeye, the line caller. And that's because that's one less factor that you have to get upset with. Premonition, yes, I think he did have good anticipation. But on the other hand, in certain situations, and you have to know your opponent a little bit with this too, but there's certain things that opponent or the general opponent most likely will do. And as you get to know them better, but even everybody will tend to go cross court on a cross court as an example. Unless the ball's short, it's short, they might go down the line. So things like that are more generic to the game. And in a sense, he was very aware of that. And so I don't know that there really was a premonition or an ability to guess totally, but he was very aware on the court of what was going on in his opponents in that respect.
Yeah, yeah, and that works well in doubles as well. It's a fast-paced game, and his angles create, the angle for the next player, and their sets up his strategy. And I don't know if I've ever seen a top 10 player that could play doubles at that elite level. Now we have, the last 20 years, and maybe before that we had double specialists, but now, some people who couldn't climb into the top 20 or top 50 teamed up with someone, and they said, well, let's specialize in doubles. And I don't know what kind of training they do, but they've taken over the last 20 years the practice of doubles to a whole different level. But, McEnroe, when he was being considered as coach for the Davis Cup, sometime, I think it was in the mid or late 90s, he mentioned on an interview that he thought that he might be able to actually play, in the Agassi Sampras stuff. He did play with them one time with Sampras, and that was fun to watch. But then a time 2 years later or so, when he was definitely an older person, and he was helping pick the team, and he said that he thought that he had an opportunity to compete at that level. So that was a pretty amazing story of his doubles career. Maybe you could comment on that.
It was interesting because in his day, most of the players and before in the 50s and 60s, you look at Emerson and Roosevelt and Laver, everyone played doubles and singles. And John was not a great practice player in the normal sense of the word. As a coach, I would look at a player in any sport, really, of someone who would react well to repetitious drills over and over and over again, so you could perform it under pressure without having to think about it. But John was not prone to do that. He was very creative. He had his own style, a style I oftentimes didn't understand, although I had full respect for it. Fortunately, was wise enough not to try to change it, although many coaches would probably try to in some ways. His practice came from playing doubles. And ironically, when he started to go down in singles, was the time he decided to save himself, so to speak, because he was getting older, and not play the doubles matches late or stay in the tournament late to play doubles if he lost in singles, because there was another tournament to get to. And that's one thing, one reason players are not playing both so much anymore. But it just it was interesting because doubles was where he got his practice, and his game in singles went down when he stopped playing doubles. And I think there was a correlation because he couldn't go out and just practice with someone. He could go out and hit a little bit maybe, but it would not be practice on a stroke or a shot or a situation like you could think of in the normal sense of the word. So specialists.
Now I remember the truth.
The specialists like the Bryan brothers, as an example, came along and maybe they get to top 50 or 30 in the world, but it's a long time to build your way up in singles now. It takes you a good year and a half or 2 years once you're out of college as a good college player to get up into the top 100 or maybe top 50 and catch up with your peers who are at the same playing level as you were when you went to college and they went right into the pros. So that's a long process. And then, as I said, you are playing, you're going to probably stay in tournament a little longer in doubles, but in so doing, you're missing a chance to get to the next tournament when you're trying to chase the ranking points, which allow you to get into a certain level of tournament. You're playing tournaments where there's a better chance of getting those points. It might be a different continent, might be on a different surface, but if you're late in a tournament playing doubles, you can't get there in time to get used to the court in singles, the surface, the time change, and so on. So it hurts your singles. So you're kind of forced into one or the other nowadays. And that's had an effect on the game. Not necessarily bad, but there are players making a living in doubles, and it's nice to see. Everyone always says doubles is so much fun to watch, but if you watch a Grand Slam on TV, when the doubles start, everyone's left. So who knows?
So I just remembered, Dick, the trajectory I was trying to weave in that talks about the militaristic and the martial arts master and the rules, et cetera. So if you walk into a yoga center, martial arts center, or boot camp, you have someone who's in charge that tells you what to do. And since you've signed up for that class or that military experience, you have to do what they say. So that's one type of a structure. And a lot of coaches, I was in school starting in the 60s in New Jersey, and we had a lot of old school coaches that were, World War II generation people, and the kids of World War II generation people. And there was a lot of, the protocol was based on military learning and, survival. Same things in martial arts. Now, yoga center is a little bit different, but when you have, a practice that's been around for thousands of years, Ayurvedic medicine and yoga probably go back, Sanskrit I think goes back 5,000 years, and then yoga and Ayurvedic medicine, Ayurvedic here and yoga is part of that, from India, that would probably go back several thousand years, if not all the way to the 5,000 year mark.
Before me.
Even before
me.
Even before René Lacoste, who's been passed on for many moons. So the comment and observations that I have is that's one way to learn. So you follow these rules and that structure, and you bow in when you get to the martial arts center. You don't say F-bombs when you get to the yoga center. You make your bed and you do what the instructor says in boot camp. So that's one part of it. But then the sergeant at boot camp, he or she has to see the difference in individuals. So if McEnroe, Agassi, and Sampras showed up at the same age, at age 18, let's say, to boot camp, they would want to look to who's the cerebral one, who's the action quiet one, who's got the skills in climbing, whatever it is. And so they use that in their platoon and in their group. And the same thing in martial arts. You walk in there and the instructor sees that everyone learns a little bit differently, a little bit different pace of learning. Sometimes the person might zone out a little bit, but then come back because they've processed it and they come back and they've got it. Some people might take a few times to get the move. Sometimes people might get it right away. So when we talk about tennis and this, for example, McEnroe, Mary Carrillo, who was, I think, 1 year to 3 years older than McEnroe, who's known him since they were kids. And she's interviewed in the documentaries about McEnroe, and she talks about how the coaches at the Queen's Club or whatever his club was and at that time, when he was 12, what have you. And she said they called him the runt because he was a little guy, and they let him off because he was like the Mozart or a different type of an artist from the other players who had to go through all these exercises and stretches, where McEnroe wanted to be playing on the court. So fortunately for McEnroe, nobody forced him into the hating of the game like could have happened if you take a Absolutely. Mozart and you say, I want you to play scales now, Mozart, at age 8, when he's one of the best people under the age of 15 on the planet. He doesn't need to play scales. He wants to create. So maybe you can share the difference between coaching, maybe it's called old school protocol, versus seeing how each person is different and working them into some sort of teamwork system.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a really great topic, I think. One I really enjoy talking about. When I started coaching, it was on the staff at Stanford, as an example, early 60s, mid 60s. It was still, most of the coaches were out of the military, had been in the military, served in the military, and they were used to authoritarianism, if you wish. And all of a sudden in the 60s, mid 60s, Vietnam came along, and people were rebelling a little bit against authority and being told to just accept it and just do this. And so they started wearing long hair. And that used to drive some of our coaches crazy. Well, can you imagine a coach getting upset about something like, there you are, the Grateful Dead shirt.
I just bought 3 of these yesterday. Have you worn a tie-dye in the last 20 years?
No, not since the Grateful Dead concerts. That's amazing. That's classic.
Here, check this one out.
Oh my gosh. Actually,
So if I see you and I have one of these, I'm going to get you one.
Anyway, I think this is so true about McEnroe at Port Washington Tennis Academy, and Antonio Palafox was a director there, and they realized this was a rare talent. And fortunately, I had an experience in junior high school that taught me the importance of this. I was coaching freshman football, the JV team of the varsity, of the high school varsity, as mostly 7th and 8th graders. And I don't think you really necessarily love contact. It's the rare person who initially loves it. I think you can learn to appreciate it. And at this age, especially 13 and 14, people are growing so differently, but different growth spurts. You had a tremendous difference in sizes, in weight and height and strength. And if you're the little guy, you don't want to be eaten up by a 200-pound guy. So, do a little bit of aversion to contact. Well, when I was coaching this team, I was the only coach of this junior varsity team at that level. And we had about 25 guys in the team. And so we really were emphasizing contact. And we had a drill where they'd start players to start about 10 yards apart and meet about 5 yards later in between each other, not enough running enough to really hurt anybody, but player A would be tackling player B and the rest of the team standing around. Then it'd be the next player C and D's turn. And so we're out there with this one-on-one tackling drill to get them used to contact and as well as the skills of tackling. And Eddie Matias, long hair coming out from under his helmet, 1966. I blow my whistle, he would run, and just before contact, 4 yards later, he slipped and fell to the left. Eddie, get your butt back up. Let's go again. Slipped, fell to the right, all the time avoiding this final contact. Third time, God darn Eddie, slipped and fell back on his back. He's lying on his back, and I go over him thinking, like, to be a successful coach, I have to be like Vince Lombardi, or like I thought Vince Lombardi was, who players love, by the way. But he had a reputation of being a really demanding coach. And to me, that meant yelling and screaming and so on, not knowing any better. And I still don't know him from that sense. But I went over and stood over him, and I said, yelled out, top of my voice, every swear word I could, until I could think of no more. It's amazing how you run out of things to say, how fast. And he sat there lying there on his back, looking up at me, the whole team standing around wondering what's going to happen, where is this going to end? And he gives me a 1-finger wave, looks up at me, and he says, F you, literally yelling the whole word out, Mr. Gould. And I was astounded. I didn't know what to do. I looked at my team. They didn't know how to react. And then all of a sudden, I just started laughing. It was so out of character for any one of those days to come back at authority with that way. But it made me think, and it taught me my second most valuable lesson. The first one is to make what you're doing exciting. The second one is to be yourself. And this was not me. And I learned it right away, and it didn't come across as though it was me. And Eddie taught me a great lesson early on before I made many more mistakes than I was to make it was. And that I could not be Vince Lombardi or some other great coach if I weren't him. We're different people. So that was a great lesson for me really early on. And I learned it was great when John came to Stanford and other players. Everyone's different. You have to be able to adapt. I think this was one of my strengths as a coach, is my adaptability and flexibility, and yet keeping everything within a team sense. And you have a little more ability to do that in a sport like tennis, because in a lot of ways it is an individual sport. If so-and-so is a pre-med student, has a lab one day, you're not screwing up the rest of the team because he misses practice. You don't have an offense to install. It's dependent on 11 guys working together at the same time and moving the same way. Or a basketball practice where you have a defense to install against a certain opponent. It's not messing up practice. So I can be more flexible that way.
Yeah, that's. I'm really glad you shared that. That's a really deep lesson that we can take forward. We talk in biological and biochemical terms now of fight, flight, and freeze. So you were out of character, you were in one of those other zones, and you didn't know quite who was coming out of you, some sort of a werewolf. And then the person challenged you on that, and then you realized, thankfully, you didn't go further into the fight or flight or freeze. You realized and you started clapping. So the tension went right out of that situation immediately. How cool is that?
Well, it was funny. I mean, I didn't know how to react. I was totally dumbfounded. And you finally just get a point where you have to laugh at it and laugh at yourself, which is a good lesson itself. Don't ever hesitate to laugh at yourself.
Yeah, that's a really important lesson. One thing I was going to share, I think I forgot to mention, when I was watching McEnroe at Roland Garros, I was a ball boy. So in 79 and 81, I had the opportunity to spend several weeks at Roland Garros every day watching these great talents. Lendl was about a year and a half older than I was when I was 16. And you could talk to him just like, you talk to your best friend. It was before cell phones and before cameras were everywhere. And he was a young person with a Czech team playing the French team. Yannick Noah, same thing, about a year older than I am. So I'm around these people who were just out of their teens. They're still teenagers because they're 18 and 19. And I'm 17 and 18, and I'm 16. So it was a very cool time in the 79 and 81 to be around, people who are going to become world famous, and, to hang out with them a little bit. And Connors, same thing. In 81, I got to hang out with them just a little bit and clown around with them on the court. And I didn't go too far with that, but I've always been a guy that pushed the envelope a little bit. And I have like a little bit of Robin Williams and George Carlin and a little bit of Michael Jackson in me. And so, maybe he could feel my aura was a good aura to have around, that I'm American from the East Coast. And he's from Illinois, I believe. Does that sound right to you?
And who is that? That's
Connors.
St. Louis originally.
St. Louis, Missouri. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a very interesting guy. I sent you that match I was watching on 76 on Hard True, and I think it's the semifinals of the U.S. Open with Borg and Connors. And as you mentioned, stepping into the shots, you can see that from Connors much more so than Borg. Borg hit a lot of, with his body in a little bit of a decline or reclining a little bit, and Connors always coming through. And when I had a debate with a coach who's a little older than I am recently, and I said, you could make the argument, and I'm not saying I'm going to make that argument, but you could make the argument that if you look at eras only, not the best talent with the modern technology, et cetera, but you can make the argument that McEnroe is the best player in the history of tennis if you look at wins, because he won in doubles and he won in singles, and he has more of those than anyone else since the pro circuit began. So you could make that argument. And he didn't agree. He thought, Federer, he mentioned, and then the other three greats of today. And I said, you have to look per era. And, in this era, you Absolutely. Have three greats, but they didn't play that much doubles. And in the history of tennis, if you go back before, doubles and mixed doubles.
You're frozen a little bit on screen, on my screen.
Part of the history of tennis. For history of tennis. Say again? You still here?
Yeah. You froze a little bit there. It's interesting. We talk about eras.
Yeah, I see it.
Same thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I was going to tell you about my experience with Roland Garros, my first experience there. I was 14 years old, and my dad was the president of Ventura Rotary Club. And they would send the president to the international convention each year. And so my dad has his expenses paid to Paris for the convention, and my family, his aunt and mom and so on all chipped in to make it possible for the entire family to go. So we're in Paris, and I see the French Open's being played. So it's 1952. And so I asked my folks, I said, the French Open's being played. They knew I was playing tennis then. And I said, do you mind if I go out to the tournament? So they said, no, go ahead. So I walked out the hotel door. Taxi, Stade Roland-Garros, s'il vous plaît. Oui, monsieur. Drove up to the semifinals. And you drove right up to where the ticket booth was, a little ticket booth on a corner of the street. And there was no one in line. And I walked in, bought a ticket, walked into a half-empty stadium. And it was a small, much smaller stadium then, of course. Got a great seat anywhere I wanted and watched Jaroslav Drobny, and who was a great player, actually, Czech expat, and playing Fausto Gardini, an Italian clay quarter, played quite a ways back in the court in those days also. And watched for about an hour, then I went back to the hotel. But it was my first time at a Grand Slam championship, one of the major championships. And I just walked up and bought a ticket and went in. Can you imagine it happening today for this semifinals in New York this week as an example, the week we're talking. So it was a different world than in terms of tennis.
Yeah.
That was my experience, my first experience with the French Open. And then I went back to a couple of tour groups back there.
Do you remember how you got to from Ventura to the airports and how that went down and what kind of flights and everything from that first trip?
Yeah, we drove down to LAX and hopped on TWA. Remember they had the little three wings in the back tail, and hopped on TWA and went overnight or whatever it was to right straight to Gaul. And it was quite an experience. We were in Europe for 6 weeks. So I saw more cathedrals and museums than I ever wanted to see in my life. In fact, it turned me off for traveling for a long time.
Yeah.
But since that time, through tennis and on my own, I've been able to go most everywhere in the world. Had some amazing trips, not all tennis related. Everything from lecturing on cruise ships to where are you in Mexico? We did a lot of Mexican Riviera trips.
We'll have a video. Here's an email I got, and that's a 1964 original of your book
Oh, tennis, anyone. That little book's amazing. It sold over 500,000 copies in 6 editions and in 3 languages. So that was a long time ago. Yeah, that's the cover of one of the original ones.
So that's from a friend, and I'll tell you I'll read you the email he sent me. This is from Norm Moncombe, currently in New Jersey, played with Rob Mazzucchelli, University of Richmond, and then transferred to Rutgers after two years. And he says, Todd, that's my other friend, Todd Bolig. He said, Todd gave this to me recently. He said, see picture below. It was Todd, my friend Todd's mom passed away in the past year or so. And he says it was his mom's, and she used it to learn how to play. It's a first edition, 1964. And my friend Norm, who worked as a tennis pro after college for a while, he said she could chip and charge with the best of Hunterdon County, and she learned from your book. How cool is that?
Well, it's interesting because the tennis boom was just starting then, and this was actually a syllabus for a class I had at Foothill Junior College, where I was teaching full-time and coaching and teaching tennis classes. And we also had a company that would train tennis instructors and supervise them and help them with their development and their teaching. And we would have as many as 50 plus teachers working in the summertime, especially, and would be working with them in their teaching ability. It was a little different than coaching a team, but something I really enjoyed. And so this was a teaching guide, and it was primarily in those days, we had physical education majors. I was one at Stanford as an example, that would be trained to teach and coach in physical education, and then get the teaching credential and go out in the education world. And that was my background and what I trained for. And so oftentimes a football coach or a basketball coach could be assigned another sport in those days. And they might be coaching tennis or golf or something like that. So this book was designed as a teacher's guide to be able to teach others to teach, or to teach others to play. And it was amazing. It was just a time at the right time and right place it caught on, and there was a book. It was Tennis du Le Monde in French version, hard copy. They had a Japanese version. It was pretty interesting. So,
Did you use any other sources? You just start putting down things that came to you as sensible from your experience?
yeah, we had a very simple, our job was to teach people to teach, mostly college students for a summer job, something like that. And you have to make it simple for them to teach, simple for their pupils to understand. It's based on simplicity. And the book is a very simple book. But it worked. And a lot of people, it was their Bible starting out. I'm embarrassed about it now because 20 or so years, the game really changed. And now instead of stepping into the ball, you're hitting it open face. And there are times, of course, you step in, but it's a different game right now.
I know you're not you mentioned that your knowledge of the past 30 years of the tour is not the tennis historian type of a thing, but do you recollect anyone doing anything like Federer, anyone from the top 20, let's say, that had any strokes that were more straight armed and more pulling the butt cap versus swinging the strings? Anybody that did those kinds of things, maybe Sampras or anybody else, before you saw Federer?
Federer, first of all, what a tremendous addition to our sport, the sport of tennis. Someone who is respected so much, just a class person in every respect, carried his championships well within himself. A great competitor, loved the game. I can't say enough about him and his influence on tennis and how beautiful it was to watch him play. Yeah. The smoothness with which he hit the ball. One thing that was happening about that time, and Sampras was probably the last guy to embrace it, was the game was becoming much more reactive and less proactive. I earned my dime by teaching people to make something happen, not to react to what someone else did, but to be the person that forced the point, which meant that I was preaching serve and volley, first and second serves. When a kid comes to Stanford, he just finally gotten his growth. He's 14 years old. He's not old enough in general or strong enough to be able to do that effectively. But most players were taught the skills of it. And then they had to come to college and they had to have the confidence to do it under pressure. And that was my job in college coaching, you talk to your players. So I would always be telling them every point what I wanted to do, where I wanted the serve to be, a kick or a body serve, and type for forehand, swing it out wide, and what to do after that. And I might make the wrong call and be wrong part of the time, but they pretty much had to do what I wanted, or they wouldn't be playing. And so it was a great way to get them to do things they probably wouldn't do under pressure. In practice, it's easy, but when push comes to shove, it's match point against you, have a chance to, or match point for you. You have a chance to get that all-time great win. You can go back to your comfort zone. And that was my job, to get them out of the comfort zone and knew what I knew they could do. And then it takes the onus off them. And if coach messes up, coach messed up, not the player's sake. The player didn't mess up. So proactive was, and putting pressure on the return of serve. I rarely would see a second serve that I didn't have my guy come in the net behind as a receiver. So then you have to react to that. And then the court started getting a little slower. They started playing farther back on the court. The open stance shots came around. I think largely, I know, is that we had a tournament at Stanford for years, almost 25 years, called the Bank of the West Classic. It was one of the top women tours leading up to the US Open, part of the US Open series. And the first time I started seeing open stance were the Williams sisters. It was a women's tournament. And in fact, the longest held women's only tournament in the country, and of major proportion. And the reason being that it saved them a step in recovery. And players are hitting the ball so hard now with the different strings, the lively ball. Courts, there wasn't much time to get to the ball. So if you were stepping into the shot when you're out wide, you lost a step and a half in recovery time. You had open stance, then that changed that. Also, the ball was bouncing a little bit higher on these courts. So players started turning their grip over from an Eastern shake hands forehand grip to a more semi-Western or Western grip. Now that grip change was critical in the evolution of tennis because that changed the stroke more than any other thing. Because now all of a sudden with that grip, you're holding the racket like this, the ball's not you're not going to hit it squarely like you would a shaking hands grip. So your swing became this, and that caused the swing to be from low to high, which took it from a longitudinal swing into a more vertical swing. And you see the swings up, and then they finish way over here. And then your whole game became from a Jimmy Connor step in the shot or a Pete Sampras step in the shot game to one that was rotational. The body of the swing changed. So then your body rotates around an axis instead of linearly going forward with the shot. And so the grip change had a lot to do with the change in tennis. And as the balls were hit harder with this grip, especially the balls were bouncing higher, couldn't do it in Eastern forehand very well. Two-handed backhand was also a factor in this. Then you just needed extra time to recover, and the open stance shots made that possible. I first open stance backhand I ever saw was Serena Williams, I believe, or Venus, I forget which one, but at the Bank of the West Championship. So the evolution of the game is kind of interesting, and you just don't see a certain ball. I've often wondered now if I had a really good talent and the player basically knew how to volley, but not really so much put it all together, if I could develop him into a world-class top 5 player with a certain volley as his predictable shot. Roger Federer used to serve volley more than he does now, but he's very capable of it. And you see a lot of players now, instead of standing just 30 feet behind the baseline, although many of them do in return to serve, amazing to me. You see them moving up and taking the ball earlier and finishing more points to the net. I feel like Craig O'Shaughnessy's done a lot of studies on this, and really good studies, and how many points are ending at the net now. And not so much with, in my day, it was hit the volley solid and hit it deep. Now the player's playing so far back, you come in and hit a McEnroe ball, you dump the ball off, feather the ball, and the players can't get up to it. So you see in essence what are now a lot of drop volleys being very effective.
My lessons with my pro, who I liken to Mr. Miyagi from the Karate Kid, the wax on, wax off. He's one of those types of people. He's a Chinese guy who's from Trinidad. Hi, Richard, if you catch this video, he's in Santa Barbara at
Oak. Is that right?
And he taught me in a few lessons about 3 months ago, the Federer forehand and the Federer backhand. So my backhand starts up high, and then it drops down, and the racket's facing the same way Federer is, and in every part. And the backhand was easy for me to learn. The forehand took a little bit more doing because I had to get further away from the ball. I grew up admiring McEnroe and Borg, so I would guess that my forehand was very similar to closer to McEnroe, but something more similar to that, but not with the straight arm that McEnroe uses, and and his shake hands grip that he uses from everywhere, which is another amazing thing. Did you know he had the same grip everywhere before he showed up at Stanford?
It's interesting. It's one thing that I've never paid any attention to is the grip, because I've been playing since it used to be 9 years old. Now it's 5 years old.
Yeah.
And I couldn't tell you what grip my players use. And in fact, it hurt me some. I had a great assistant coach, John Whitlinger, for a number of years, became our head coach when I retired. And one of our players, a guy named Alex Kim, living in Seoul, Korea now. Alex won the NCAA championship, but only when his forehand became a weapon. And he was a very classic player from the Middle States and an Eastern forehand. And John turned his forehand over a little bit more to a semi-Western. And all of a sudden, his forehand's a weapon and he wins the NCAAs. So that was one I missed that my assistant coach fortunately covered for me on, and Alex became a top 100 player because of it.
The question I have from Rob Mazzucchelli, who's involved with Sport Ed TV, which I believe you're part of. Sports Ed TV. You can look him up there and other coaches. He said, asked Dick what it was like to coach a team where the number 5 player, Gene Mayer, would go on to be ranked number 4 in the world.
Robert, that's great. Well, Robert does a lot of work. Robert knows Gene does a lot of work with Sports Ed TV. By the way, I'll put a little plug in right now. This is a tremendous resource for all sports, including the martial arts. It's a web-based learning. They have a really good collection of programs and presentations by different experts. Gene Mayer did a lot of work for them. Exceptional teacher, got that from his dad, and then who I learned a lot from. Jeff Salstein's done a lot of work with him as well as some others. But Robert's he's one of the principals of the company, and he's done a great job with this. sportsedtv.com, and I would certainly recommend people take a look at it. It's a great resource for all kinds of things dealing with sport and sport technique and the mental side as well. So Robert, congratulations on a great job. Yes, that's true. Gene Mayer never played higher than 4 or 5 in the team, but in those days our team was so strong. We had 8 scholarships. Later on, it was cut down to 4.5 because of Title IX. The women had 6. The women had 8. Men got cut to 4.5 to balance out from football, the number of scholarships there. But we had just great depth in those days. And Jeannie's brother Sandy was an NCAA champion, Alex Mayer. And Jeannie was, at the time he was in college, his dad was changing him, who was a great coach, by the way. He was an international or a ping pong national champion, but he really understood the game well. He understood angles well. He would come out and visit his sons every spring break, and I would sit wherever he was with them in practice. I'd sit as close as I could to his court because I picked up things from him throughout. The biggest thing I learned from him was hitting around the outside of the ball in those days. Now the game has changed, but on your volleys and on your ground strokes, getting around the outside of the ball. But he was a wealth of information for me to learn from. Jeannie went on and was working at Stanford. His dad was changing from a 2-handed backhand to a 1-handed backhand. And so in his time there, all he could really do was was chip and lob. And that's a pretty big liability. And when he got out of Stanford, his dad moved him back to a 2-handed backhand. And then all of a sudden he just took off with his game and became, I think, 4 in the world, 4 or 5 in the world, 4, I believe. And truly a great player. One of the smartest players I've ever seen.
Yeah, that's the other thing I wanted to mention. I've been following boxing most of my life, and the people who talk about the individual, the boxer, they talk about the boxing IQ and the survival IQ and the ability to change angles, the ability to know when to go and when to hold and when to run. All these things are really important in boxing. And the same thing translates to any sport, but boxing and tennis have a lot of similarities, the ebbs and flow of the game, the footwork, the when to go and when to not go. All these things are really wonderful. And I think, it's an athletic competition, but it's got so much of like a gambling mentality in it that you really have to know when to do that thing. And I remember watching Rob Mazzucchelli and the players in college. And, I even talked to them after some of their matches about what they were doing. And did you ever try this? And I got to learn a lot just by watching. And when I was trying to learn surfing back in the late 90s, I met a guy in Ventura out at C Street, near the Amtrak and the fairgrounds there, which is my go-to spot. And I said, I'm getting into surfing. He said, what do you recommend? He said, what have you been doing? I said, boogie boarding. He said, okay, how good are you at boogie boarding? I said, I'm really good. I can go into 6, 7, 8 foot waves and not get thrown around and ride them pretty well. And he says, well, how about this? He said, why don't you watch the surfers for a while? And I said, that's really good advice. Yeah. Do you have any idea on how long I should do it? He says, you will know when you know. He was giving me the Californian aloha blessing of the wave, the coast, the rocks, the other surfers, the sharks, whatever. You will know when you know. It's another one of those Mr. Miyagi moments. And that really helps me in my surfing. And I think the same thing with tennis. The more I watch those guys at my college and the people at the French Open and the Davis Cup when I was there ball boying, and then all these great matches on tennis, I learned from McEnroe. I had a discussion with this guy, Richard, Mr. Miyagi in Santa Barbara. And I said, McEnroe's skill, besides all those other things, you don't realize how much he's hitting through every shot. Yeah, the footwork gets him to the ball, gets him in the right position. He takes it early, but he's getting his weight forward so frequently. Even on his puff backhand, he's got a motion going forward and he's got that control. And I think that's a thing that might be overlooked by many people. Maybe you can comment on some of these Mr. Miyagi and going forward moments I just shared.
Well, I think I'll backtrack for a minute and talk about surfing in Ventura. And growing up, you didn't have the ties to your ankle. And so when you fell off, the board would go into the rocks and you have to go get it, and you climb, and it didn't have wetsuits in those days when I was trying it a little bit as a high school student. And so I wasn't long lived for surfing. It was just not much fun chasing the board in the rocks and going back out again. Although my roommate in college was acknowledged as the best big wave surfer in the world for a number of years. And it was really good, Ricky Gregg. At any rate, I think going forward is really, really important. You mentioned it in boxing. You have to know when to go forward, when to back off. That does relate to tennis in that way. When your defense, when to go for the kill. Tennis is the same thing, and all these sports relate so much. I did a forward for a book on, what do you call it, Sensei, yes, that a friend of mine who was a coach at the University of Hawaii wrote, and it was equating Sensei to tennis all the way through the book, and he's a big martial arts guy. And I didn't know what I was talking about, but I found it a fascinating read. And so I think there's really a lot to be said for there are times you might want to back up a little bit and you might want to take a punch or two, but that's only to set up the next move. And I think the idea of being on the attack and being aggressive for me was the benchmark of my success, frankly.
Yeah, that's really important. So there's an IQ, there's a sensibility, there's a planning involved, and split-second planning involved in boxing and tennis and many other sports. And then you mentioned reaction and proactive and these types of things. There's a wave that you have to ride, and when you master that wave, you know when to change. I remember watching the interview that Wielander was hosting some shows where they had Lendl, Becker, and McEnroe. They're on YouTube. They're really fun to watch, these people with gray hair with all of their wisdom. And Wielander is such a nice person. I imagine he was just a nice person by nature. And he jokes about himself. He said, I never took a risk in my life, especially on the court. He just outlasted people, but he did take some risks. He came to the net from sometimes, but he's very fun to listen to his self-deprecation. And McEnroe does the same thing about his weaknesses, et cetera. But Lendl said one thing that I'll never forget. He said the players that we were in 80 and 82 were nothing like the players we were by 1984 and then afterwards. He said we had changed so much in our training. And when I saw Noah in Paris, he was getting massage. There's a documentary called Roland Garros 1981, or the French Open, and it's about the 81. A famous film director did a documentary. And they interviewed me for that, talking about Connors and talking about my life being over there. But I didn't get into the final cut, unfortunately. If the director is still around or anybody has that original footage, I'd like to see my minute interview if you have it. I'm Henry, the young American ball boy in Paris in 81 at age 18. But anyway, Lendl said the game had changed so much and we had adapted and we had advanced. So he said, we would have cleaned our own clocks, if we had gone back 2 or 3 years to 81, because we had advanced so much. And the difference between Lendl and McEnroe in singles is Lendl kept doing that. That's why he was able to hang with the Beckers and these types of people. McEnroe was running. I honor what he did. He said, I want to do some other things. He got into family. He got into his guitar playing. He was a great commentator. He got into art collecting, opened up, art galleries, and probably many more things. But eventually wound up with 5 kids and this huge tennis center in New York. And he's a very active dude, and he likes to hang out with fun people, right? So he's had a really cool life, and he didn't just set his goal of winning for 20 years, which these 3 greats of today, and to Lendl a certain extent did that. And so I honor McEnroe's path, and that's why I still say you could make the argument for his era, because of those wins. He did all he had to do to be considered the guy who won the most tournaments in singles and doubles in the pro era. Anything I shared before we wrap this up that you want to comment on?
Yeah, I think things did change then. I know for me, all of a sudden, there was weight training in the college athletics. I had to do that originally because we didn't have a strength coach assigned to tennis, but everyone else is doing it. That's the only reason I did it. I didn't believe in it. I didn't see any studies that showed you were less prone to get injured. I didn't see any studies showing that extra strength increased your serve speed by 2 miles an hour. I was just doing it on faith because everyone else was doing it. And I didn't want that time. I'd rather have that time on the court than, we don't have that much time. You're a college student. You got to study a little bit too. And you have a social life. So we had 4 hours a day we could practice, and we were never on the courts more than 2.5 hours. And I would allot 30 minutes to conditioning / strength training on alternate days. And if it went over that, I'd get really ticked at the guy who's doing it, said, you have to be more efficient. I want my guys out of here, get them out of the tennis facility, out of the strength room. Same thing with conditioning. I mean, tennis during the season is pretty good conditioner itself. So only just before the Nationals, a few weeks before, going into a big humid area, will we work extra hard in our conditioning. But that was about the time things were changing. And so I had to change with it. And it became a pretty much accepted way of doing things. I just wanted to be sure that when it was being done with my team by strength coaches and conditioning coaches, that it was done effectively and in a time effective manner. You mentioned some great names there, and in the early 2000s, 2001 and 2001, we had a senior event at Stanford. And the headliners were McEnroe, Connors, Borg, and Wielander. And I'll never forget a quote I saw to Matt, and it really put things in perspective for me. Matt, as you may remember, was a very close to a top player, the very top player, but never quite made it. And all of a sudden he won Wimbledon in one of those tournaments, and he became number 1 in the world. Yeah. And the next 2 years, he barely won a match. And everyone behind his back was saying, what's wrong with Mats? What's wrong with Mats? And the quote that I saw was something like this. He said, well, my goal was to be number 1, and I finally made it. And I had fulfilled my own personal goal. And I didn't care if beyond that point what happened to me in terms of tennis. I play now because I enjoy the game and without any high-powered goal like that. I found myself that I was so obsessed when I started coaching of winning a national championship and proving to other people that it could be done at Stanford, that was all I talked about to my team. And in essence, I was putting more pressure on them to perform. And when we finally won a championship, I didn't care whether I thought I died and gone to heaven. I didn't care if we ever won another one again. And yet we won one the next year with a whole different team. And then we kept winning. But that was not my intent after we won one. And I can relate totally to Mats. And there was another great song. I can't remember who sung it, but it was about that time. Is that all there is? And I don't remember the total lyrics. I don't remember who sang a very sultry song. And it was like, I reached a goal or whatever, marriage or whatever. And is that all there is? And once you get something, then, what else beyond that is there to do? So it's interesting the drive that some players have. And of course, McEnroe, Connors, even to that day in 2000, even to today, are not best friends in the court. Jimmy Connors is a neighbor of yours in Santa Barbara. Been living there for years.
I saw him at Costco a few years ago.
Or on the golf course. He's playing a lot of golf. And a really good guy. I remember his mom would come to the junior tournaments that we would stage at Stanford or in the area. And she was one mom, and then his grandmother was two mom. And his mom would always say, Jimmy, be a tiger, be a tiger. And on the court while he's playing, be a tiger, Jimmy. And that was his reminder to be ferocious on the court, to go for it, to go for it, to go for it.
Yeah.
So these players all have different backgrounds. Ward was very laid back in so many ways. His heartbeat, I hear, was around 40 or something like that, or very low.
Yeah.
But actually, in reality, quite an effective serve and volleyer. You didn't think it was being such, but he was pretty effective doing that. Different kind of player, different kind of style from Nylander, from Mac, and from Connors. But they were all different, but they all added to the game in a great era.
Is there a chance we could do another one of these where we talk about your most recent book and then my book, The Aging Athlete?
The Aging Athlete. The aging never was athlete.
Well, my book is called The Aging Athlete. What I do with that, you probably saw it in my promo stuff, is that I look at athletes before, during, and after their high performance years, and what their lifestyle is like, what their mind, body, and spirit's up to at those times. And it's a really interesting subject. I'm up to 1,869 interviews since 2009 on that subject. And I would guess for someone who doesn't have a staff of people or a radio show, I can't imagine anybody having done more interviews with athletes since then.
Wow. The Williams sisters would be a good study because they're so versatile in what they give their dad so much credit for how I raised them, dad and mom.
I've watched some of the YouTube interviews of the dad, and fascinating stuff. That would be a great discussion. But if you're open to it, we could do one where we talk about your recent book and some of my things that I found, and you may have some comments on that. And then I have one final comment here from Ferenc Hodashi, who's a pro in Santa Barbara, California, at the Santa Barbara Tennis Club, and he won the Western States back in the 80s. And he says, because I asked him for some questions to ask of Dick Gould, and he said, these questions that he's asking are going to cost me a few free golf lessons, because I wanted to do some trades, my golf lessons for his tennis lessons. I've been at golf since I was 6, and I'm a good teacher. Anything that I can do better than the other person with me, or even if they're better than me, I have a vision that I can see what they're not doing that they were doing 2 shots ago. Like in golf, I play with some people who are pros, and I can see when they're a little bit off, and they can't see because they don't have a camera there, right? Yeah. But anyway, here's the question from Ferenc Hodashi. He says, what was the main ingredient he saw in his best and most successful players?
I think the ones that embrace the concept of first strike tennis, making something happen instead of reacting to something that's happened. And that's not necessarily, you put yourself at risk when you do that, and you expose yourself, and you're naked in a lot of ways. The ball is going to go by you some, but will that be counterbalanced by the success you have by being proactive and putting yourself in position to end the point first? I think that's probably the thing that the players I had was pretty much synonymous with their success, and the thing that would set them apart maybe from many others.
Wonderful. So do you want to share your website or how people can find out more about you, Dick?
I don't have a website, but actually the book has one which has some background information. It's www.anatomyofachampion.net, not .com, .net, anatomyofachampion.net. And there's a lot more on there than just promos in the books and interviews and things like that people might find of interest.
So I'm Sifu Slim, and I've had the chance to spend time with Dick from Ventura today. And if you're ever back in that area, we'll get together. But I always wanted to play golf at the golf course at Stanford. I've been there a few times trying to meet neighbors and somebody else who could get me on the course, but it was always been spur of the moment. It was never a planned thing that I found myself in Palo Alto. But as a golfer, I'd certainly love to play that. So I'll keep that vibe open in case anybody can get me out there. And so my website, theagingathlete.com. I'm Sifu Slim, traveling the globe. I'm currently in Tijuana, Mexico, which is where I got these lovely tie-dyed shirts. And these were only $10 per shirt in 2022. So what a deal. And they're very nicely made, very nice fruit of the loom, heavy duty cotton, HD cotton right there. But the more successful I become, we're talking about successful tennis players, the more successful I become, even though I'm a conservative, not politically, but I'm just a conservative person, playful, yet, don't swear and don't drink and drugs and all that stuff. But the more successful I become, the more you will see me in this type of garb, and the less you'll see me clean shaven. So that'll be your clue to the success that I have. I'll be the Richard Branson,
true aging athlete.
True aging athlete, the Richard Branson of aging athlete writers, philosophers. And if you see me, come up and I'll tell you where I got my tie-dyed shirts. How about that? Thank you, Dick. And I'll send you an email. We'll try to regroup on that other one in the coming weeks or months, whenever the schedule permits. And if McEnroe is out there, I'd love to interview you. I'm a huge fan, and I met you a few times. So connect with me through theagingathlete.com, and anyone else who'd care to give me an hour or two of their time. I'd love to interview some interesting people in the sports world, the sports medicine world, the sports psychology world, and really cool, interesting people. I'm kind of opening my show from athletes and sports philosophy up like Joe Rogan started out in martial arts. I'm opening up to, a wider variety of topics. So I'm open. So help me out with that. And please like and subscribe. And fortunate that Dick Gould said yes. And I appreciate that. And we'll talk very soon, Dick. Thanks so much.
Sifu, thank you. I really enjoyed it and look forward to reading The Aging Athlete.
Take care, brother.